Recently, there was rumors about a serial killer roaming the streets of Kansas City, and no one was reporting on it. This all went viral on TikTok a couple weeks ago, which was weird because a serial killer in 2022 is more than unlikely, since thousands of cameras are now roaming the world, makes it impossible for them to exist. Well, turns out this was false. The police have already debunked the rumors. But since we're already talking about, Kansas City, let's talk about the infamous butcher of Kansas City. Robert Andrew Berdella Jr., an American serial killer who kidnapped, raped, tortured, and murdered at least 6 young men, forcing his victims into long periods of pain. His crimes took place in Kansas City, Missouri, between the years of 1984 and 1987. Robert describes his murders as being some of his darkest fantasies that became reality. Robert Berdella pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He was charged with 6 first-degree murder. But how did Robert Berdella turn into a monster? How did he become the butcher of Kansas City? We have to go back into his early life and see how Robert was like as a child. How was he born? What family surrounded him? Was he surrounded in a horrible environment, or was he surrounded in a loving family? Every serial killer has its own background, their own story, their own origin as to how they became who they are. And in Robert's case, once we dig deep down into his life, we are going to see that Robert did show some signs, some early signs of what was to become of young Robert. Robert Berdella was born on January 31st, 1949, in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. He is the first of 2 born to Robert Andrew Berdella Sr. and Mary Louise Berdella. Berdella's father was a devout Roman Catholic of Italian descent. The family regularly attended mass gatherings. Both sons regularly attended religious education courses. They were very religious. Little Robert was an intelligent boy, but he was very lonely, didn't have friends, rarely hung outside. Also, Robert had a speech impediment and wore glasses at the age of 5. He was severely nearsighted and couldn't see from long distance, and he was also diagnosed with high blood pressure. As a result of Robert, he had to take several medications. Robert didn't really exercise. He wasn't athletic. Unlike his younger brother, Daniel, displayed interest in different sports at a young age. Robert's father, Robert Sr., valued sports and physical education highly, so he saw his oldest son as a failure compared to Daniel. Robert Sr. favored Daniel, but yet that still didn't stop Robert Sr. from abusing his children and using leather straps to beat them. Robert did well in school, although teachers were finding difficult to teach him, part due to his aloofness and his experiences with bullies. He was bullied because he struggles to socialize with other students, as he was a really quiet and lonely boy. When Robert hit puberty, he discovered that he was homosexual, but he kept that secret for many years. But yet, in his early teens, he did have one girlfriend for a while. Robert, in his mid-teens, displayed a lot of self-confidence, which would often cause Robert to have attitude towards his peers, often being really rude. But he did all this towards women. Robert would learn some set of skills, such as cooking, art, and he also showed a lot of showmanship. On Christmas Day, 1965, Robert and his family went to visit some relatives in Canton, Ohio. That evening, an unexpected tragedy would happen. Robert Sr. suffered a heart attack and didn't make it. He passed away at the age of 39. 2 days later, Robert returned to Cuyahoga Falls alone. When he arrived, his family informed about the death of his father. Robert started getting more into religion to cope with the death of his father. And later he read extensively about different types of faiths. But then later on he became cynical about religion. In that same year, Robert would watch The Collector, a movie based on the novel by John Fowles. The plot of the film revolves around a disturbed man who stalks and abducts young women, whom he finds attractive, holds them captive under his basement, and decides to torture them and do experiments with these women. After several weeks, the women die from an illness, despite the captor's effort to keep her alive. Robert later stated that this movie had formed a long-lasting impression on him. This was probably one of the images that Robert kept in his head that could possibly would make him do what he did later in the future. After the death of his father, Robert's mother decided to remarry, which upset him. It upset him because he viewed this as a betrayal against his father. As a result, Robert became withdrawn and he immersed himself in his hobbies, such as painting, collecting stamps, with pen pals that he met around the world. He would write letters to different people around the world, such as Vietnam and Burma. These pen pals gave Robert a lot of stamps and photographs of historical and mythical creatures or architecture. And that would later inspire Robert to open his store and sell such items. So far, what we see of Robert is that Robert is a lonely boy, quiet boy who is rude to women, and that movie that he watched also had that impact on him. So those are two things that we've seen of Robert's life. That's a little weird. In summer of 1967, Robert finally graduated from Cuyahoga Falls High School. Throughout his high school life, Robert earned excellent grades and displayed such high potential. In the year prior, one teacher placed him in an independent study program. Shortly after graduating, Robert moved to Kansas City and enrolled in the Kansas City Institute with the goals of becoming a college professor. He was considered a talented student, although by his second year, Berdella became vocally anti-authoritarian. He also became acquainted with the clique of students who supplied him with drugs, which he began abusing. Also, he began to abuse alcohol and started torturing animals. For example, Robert would decapitate dogs in front of his classmates. He also experimented with dogs with sedatives and tranquilizers. At the age of 19, Robert was arrested trying to sell meth to an undercover cop. He was released on a bond of $3,000 and then pleaded guilty and was handed out a 5-year suspension. A month after his arrest, Robert and 2 other students were arrested due to possession of weed and LSD in Johnson County. This time though, Robert did not have the money to post for bond, so he had to spend 5 days in jail. Though later the charges will be dropped due to lack of evidence. In 1969, Robert decided to drop out of the Kansas City Institute of Arts after receiving criticism for killing and cooking a duck as art. Robert stayed in Kansas City. In September of that year, he moved into his home. After getting his own home, Robert was openly gay and began spending time with prostitutes, drug addicts, and petty criminals. Robert would normally best friend these people, then try to free them from their drug addictions or criminal lifestyles. Although he was adamant that throughout much of the 1970s, he had no physical contact whatsoever with any of these individuals. Robert felt like a foster parent to many of the young people, man. Robert became friends with many of these young men and keep them company. But Robert became very frustrated and stressed because these people ignored Robert's efforts to try to help them to move away from their own demise, meaning getting away from their own self-despair, their addiction. But even though he tried to help these people, Robert would engage in sexual acts with these young men and would establish some sort of control to these individuals. Some methods that he used was loaning these people with money, allowing them to live rent-free at his house. To his neighbors, Robert was a flamboyant yet helpful and civil-minded individual. Despite generally unkept state of his property and his somewhat haughty attitude, in the late 70s, Robert would assist in activities for the South Hyde Park Crime Prevention and Neighborhood Association, becoming their chairman in the early 1980s and encouraging neighborhood watch patrols. He remained active until the mid-80s, then relinquished his position as he would also represent his neighbors at fundraising events for a local public television station. Although he would also disengage himself from these events by the mid-80s. Before moving into his new address, he began working as a short order cook in various restaurants around Kansas City in order to pay the lawyer fees for his fines he received when he was 19. As means for obtaining additional income, he would also sell the antiques that he acquired by contacting these pen pals throughout the world, such as Africa, Asia, South America, and various Pacific Rim countries. He would initially start a little business in his home. Robert began having a success in both careers, a side job, and began working as a senior cook at several renowned Kansas City restaurants. Also joining a local chiefs association and helping establish a training program for aspiring chefs at a local community college. Simultaneously, as his own business began to burgeon, he began to devote more of his attention to his own business as opposed to his work as a chef. By 1981, Robert would open his own antique business and he started to go full time on his business, leaving his job as a chef behind. In 1982, Robert started renting a booth at a flea market in Westport named Bob's Bizarre Bazaar. He sold and traded primitive art, jewelry, and antiques, although occasionally making a generous monthly profit. The income he typically generated via his business was often not sufficient to maintain his daily expenses and to make ends meet. As a result, Robert began to scavenge and oftentimes steal items to sell on his booth. On his job, Robert became friends with a merchant by the name of Paul Howell, who also had his own booth. Robert started to get close to Paul's younger son, Jerry Howell. Jerry and his friends often made fun of Robert for his sexuality. Although, according to Robert, Jerry later confided in him that he and his friends often earned money by prostitution. By the early 1980s, Powell Howell had relocated his business to a store close to the intersection of 39th and Main Street. His family also moved into an apartment above the shop. Robert remained a casual friend of the family and offering assistance if Jerry ever got into minor problems with the law. By summer of 84, Jerry had become 19. Jerry would become the butcher's first victim. On July 5th, 1984, Robert had promised young Jerry to drive him to attend a dancing contest and marry him. According to Robert, he gave Jerry a lot of alcohol, Valium, and acetaminophen both in his car and his house until Jerry became unconscious, then injected him with a heavy tranquilizer before tying him to his bed. He tied him up for 28 hours. During these 28 hours, Robert drugged, tortured, sexually abused, and used object in Jerry, repeatedly ignoring Jerry's pleas as to why he was doing this to him. During this time, as his plea for his freedom, Jerry asphyxiated on his own vomit, and a combination of the medicines were too strong for Jerry to catch his breath. Robert would later state that he attempted to perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation upon Howell after he had died before dragging his body to the basement. Then he suspended Jerry's body above a large cooking pot and started making incisions to his inner elbows and jugular vein, then leaving the body overnight as the body drains off all the blood. The following day, Robert used a chainsaw, boning knives, and began to dismember Jerry, and then wrapping his body parts in newspaper and trash bags, then leaving the bags outside near the garage bins for the garbage crew to come and collect it to take it to the landfill. Later questioned by officers, Robert claimed to have driven Jerry to marry him like he had promised. And then after that, they both went their own separate ways, and he hasn't seen him since. Robert would keep the details of his murders in a diary. He documented each sex act and physical torture he did to his victims. He would remain adamant to investigators that this would be not for his enjoyment, but what he termed his physical and mental satisfaction. On April 10th, 1985, a former logger, a 20-year-old Robert Sheldon, arrived at Robert's house, asking to stay for a period of time. Even though Sheldon paid rent, he considered him an inconvenience and not attractive. He chose to drug and held Sheldon captive on April 12th. Once he got home from work, he found Sheldon drunk in his home. But Robert had an anger towards others. He didn't see no malice in Sheldon, but saw an opportunity to take his anger he had towards others. Sheldon was drugged with sedatives and held captive in the second floor bedroom for 3 days, enduring all forms of torture, such as the swabbing of drain cleaner in his left eye, the insertion of needles beneath his fingertips, the binding of his wrist with piano wire, with the intention of permanently damaging the nerves in his hands, and filling his ears with caulking to reduce his hearing. Days after Robert started torturing Sheldon, a workman came over to perform some work for the roofs. That led Robert to suffocate Sheldon with a sack over his head using a rope to tighten the sack. He later dissected Sheldon's body in the third floor of the bathroom. Robert finds Mark Wallace, who Robert knew from a previous encounter with some yard work Mark provided to Robert. Mark was hidden in Robert's tool shed to seek shelter from a thunderstorm. Robert invited Mark inside his home. Robert noticed Mark's state of depression and his tenseness, so he volunteered to inject Mark with chloroformise with the explanation this would calm down and relax him. Wallace winningly accepted the offer and 30 minutes later decided to keep them captive, just like he did with Sheldon. Once again, enduring torture almost every day in the second floor bedroom, including the application of alligator clips to his nipples to facilitate electrical shocks to his body, at any point which Wallace began regressing into a state of unconsciousness. According to Robert, 1 hour after his experimenting with hypodermic needles by inserting them into various muscles upon his victim's back. Mark Wallace died through a combination of the drugs, the gag, and the lack of oxygen. He noted the victim's time of death being 7 p.m. on June 23rd. On September 26, 1985, Robert received a phone call from an old acquaintance named James Ferris. Ferris asked Robert if he could stay in his home for a short period of time. Robert gladly accepted, then agreed to meet at the bar. Despite the brutality to which he had subjected his first 3 victims, Berdella claimed that Ferris was the first victim upon he intentionally inflicted torture. Robert drugged James with tranquilizers. He put on a meal, tied him up, and began his horrifying fantasies for 27 hours. Robert shocked James repeatedly with 7,700 volts to the shoulder and his genitals for 5 minutes each, and injected hypodermic needles to his neck and genitals. Ferris gradually became delirious. Despite that, Robert continued his physical and sexual assault until he was assured James was unable to sit up for more than 10 to 15 seconds. Finally, James would suffer to his injuries and died. Robert's 5th victim was Todd Stoops, 23 years of age, and a drug addict and sometimes did prostitution, who alongside his wife had lived twice in Robert's home in 1984. After Stoops and his wife moved out of Berdella's home the second time, Berdella did not see him again until a chance encounter at Kansas City Liberty Memorial Park on June 17, 1986. Berdella invited him to his house with an offer of lunch. Also offered him sex, since Todd needed money to buy drugs. Robert was extremely attractive to Todd. Todd was held captive for 2 weeks before he died, Robert increasing the brutality to make Todd cooperative. Robert used electrical shocks through Stoops' closed eyes in an attempt to blind them, and injected drain cleaner into his larynx to try to silence his screaming. During the second week of his capture, Stoops asked Berdella for a soft drink and sandwich. When Berdella refused, Stoops burst into tears. On June 27th, he ruptured Stoops' anal wall with his fist, causing bleeding and discharge. Towards the end of Stoops' captivity, he tried to feed his captive ice cream and soup, although Stoops wasn't able to keep anything down. By the final day of his captivity, Stoop was so weak, Berdella later stated that he had been unable to breathe in a sitting position. On July 1st, 1986, Stoops died. A forensic pathologist later testified that he ruptured Stoops' anal wall and caused a septic shock, which proved fatal. In the spring of 1987, Robert became friends with the 20-year-old named Larry Wayne Pearson, not knowing what would be his ultimate demise. The casual friendship began with Pearson entered his shop and explained to Robert. As a child, he had held an interest in both witchcraft and wizardry. Shortly thereafter, Pearson temporarily lodged with Robert and started performing chores around his home as a means of paying rent. Robert didn't intend to capture Larry, but formed a plan to do so. On June 23, having to bail Larry out of jail, the young man began to joke about the robberies that he used to do to gay men in Wichita. That same evening, Robert ensured that Larry became drunk, still alive but unconscious, before injecting him with chloroformise and moving him down to his basement, where he bound Pearson above his head, then linked the rope he had used for this purpose to a brick column, before injecting Pearson's larynx with drain cleaner. He then brought a electrical transformer to the basement. There, Robert could commence his activities. James was by far the most cooperative of his 6 murder victims. On the 5th day of his captivity, having by this stage endured high torture with the electrical shocks with the transformer, and breaking several bones from his hand with a metal rod, Larry started earning Robert's trust by cooperating in his physical and sexual abuse. As a form of a reward, Robert moved Larry to the 2nd floor and informing Larry that if he continued to cooperate, he would not continue to inflict much pain upon him, as he had done while he had been held captive in the basement. Throughout the latter part of his 6 weeks of captivity, Pearson trained himself to sleep without moving in order that he did not antagonize Robert, thus further torturing and being sent back to the basement. After 6 weeks of torture, Larry bit Robert's penis, screaming to Robert that he couldn't take this poor treatment anymore, which triggered Robert and caused him to bludgeon him to unconsciousness with a tree limb, then suffocating him with a bag, before driving to the hospital to receive treatment for his wound. Pearson's body was later dismembered in the basement, and his head initially stored in a plastic bag inside Berdella's freezer before being buried in the backyard. After murdering 6 males, Robert decided to go find his last victim. Instead of them coming to him, Robert decided to go hunt for his last victim. At 1 a.m. on March 29, 1988, Berdella abducted his last victim, a 22-year-old male prostitute named Christopher Bryson, who he lured to his house upon the promise of paid sex. At Robert's house, Bryson was knocked out unconscious with an iron bar. Then Robert bounded him into his bed like his previous victims, where he was subjected to similar methods of abuse and torture endured by previous victims. Although in Bryson's case, Robert repeatedly swabbed his eyes with ammonia before telling Bryson, "The only thing you need to think about are you, me, and this house," Robert said. After several days, Robert explained to Bryson he had begun to trust his captive And although he was willing to discuss aspects of the abuse and torture he was receiving, there would be no negotiations pertaining to his sexual abuse. Robert finished his discussion with a stern warning. I've gotten this far with other people before, and they are dead now because of mistakes that they made. Bryson. By the third day of his capture, Bryson had earned sufficient trust from Robert to persuade him to establish a daily regime of tying his hands in front of him after his sexual abuse, rather than above his head, restricting circulation to his arms. Bryson begged Robert to leave the TV on before leaving for work. Bryson constantly had thoughts of escaping, but the following day, Bryson manages to free himself from the restraints using a book of matches when Robert had left the room. There, Bryson manages to escape the house of the butcher of Kansas City by jumping through a window on the second floor wearing nothing but a dog collar, breaking a bone in his foot in the process. Then he ran towards a meter reader walking across the other side of the street, shouting for this individual to call the police. That person led Bryson to his home and called the police. And arriving within minutes, Bryson was then questioned at the scene by 4 cops. Bryson told the officers that he had been hitchhiking when he was abducted by Robert and was tortured. After telling the officers what happened to him and seeing his eyes swollen and scars over his body, Bryson was then taken to a medical center to attend his injuries. Meanwhile, the cops were busy trying to get a search warrant to search Robert's home. During the questioning at the police department, Bryson started telling the police officers that Robert had shown him a Polaroid pictures of his other victims and how Robert threatened him with more pain or even death. In the afternoon of the same day, Robert was arrested on charges pertaining to the sexual assault of Christopher Bryson. Robert declined the entry to his home, the police, but earlier that day they requested a warrant to search his home. So the police made their way into the horrors that awaited them. Investigators discovered the bedroom on the second floor was found to have burnt ropes attached to the post and the foot of the bed. Also, in the room was an electrical transformer plugged into a wall, and with wires leading to the bed, a metal tray containing syringes, small bottles apparently containing prescription drugs, swabs, and eye drops were also close to the bed. Also found in the room were a long iron pipe, various lengths of rope, and leather belts. Investigators also noted that posts on the bed had been extensively worn, suggesting that restraints had earlier been tied to these posts, and that the individual or individuals had struggled to free themselves. As they kept searching the house, the investigators uncovered human skull inside a closet on the second floor of his property, and a partially decomposed human head in the backyard. Their search also uncovered several human vertebrae scattered. They also found a hacksaw, a knife, several human teeth. Both a hacksaw and a miter were discovered in the basement of the property, and the chainsaw was also found to be soiled with bloodstains, flesh, and pubic hair. Luminol tests revealed that the floor of Robert's basement and 2 plastic trash barrels were extensively bloodstained. 334 Polaroid pictures and 34 snapshot prints of various male individuals were also found within Berdella's house. These pictures showed Christopher Bryson and several other men, both in life and in death. Many images have been taken as the subjects had been taken as the victims endured torture. Their search also uncovered numerous restraints and sexual devices, pornographic literature, hypodermic needles, and a book of narcotics. Officers also discovered a stereographer pad containing detailed torture logs that he had maintained for each victim above a chest of drawers. Several newspapers clippings from the Kansas Star regarding missing young men named Jerry Howell, and both wallet and driving licenses belong to the missing person named James Ferris, was discovered in a closet on the second floor of the property. Before the search, Robert's property had concluded. The Kansas City Police Department assembled a special task force of 11 detectives and one sergeant to focus exclusively on Robert's case. This task force extensively researched Robert's history, discovering that he was a well-known individual among Kansas City male hustlers, having earned a reputation for preying on transient young men. Several of these male prostitutes were also reluctant to accept him as a client, both of his penchant for drugging, injecting, and torturing his sexual partners and acquaintances. Also because he had been long considered a suspect in the disappearance of two men whose personal possessions had been found in his house, Jerry Howe and James Ferris. Missing person reports had been filed in relation to both of these men, and Robert had been extensively questioned in relation to both of these disappearances. In both instances, he was denied having anything to do with these individuals. Despite being considered a prime suspect in both of these cases and being placed under surveillance, police had been unable to find any solid evidence linking him to either man's disappearance. And in both instances, after giving his initial statement to police, Robert had refused to talk further without a lawyer present. He would later have his lawyer threaten to file harassment accusations against the police unless their questioning and surveillance of him seized James Ferris' wife, identified him in several instant photos found at Robert's property, some taken after her husband's death. Howell formerly identified one picture of a young man hanging upside down in Berdella's basement as depicting his son. Several other Polaroid images depicted as yet unidentifying young men. And several detectives were assigned the task of identifying each individual depicted to determine if he was alive or dead. And if alive, Robert was ordered to pose nude for a series of photographs in order that portions of his body could be photographed in the precise angle depicted within these images for comparison with the original Polaroid images. Police started to trace suspects or people connected, and one of these names was Freddie Kellogg. Freddie told the police that all of the things he knew about Robert, further stated that numerous male prostitutes and addicts had been reluctant to engage in any form of contact with Robert because of all the rumors regarding his links to the 1984 disappearance of Jerry Howell. Kellogg was able to name 3 of the individuals depicted in the Polaroids as being Todd Stoops, Robert Sheldon, and Larry Wayne Peterson. These investigators would shortly discover Robert had paid a $30 fee to secure a bond for Peterson in June 1987, and that no further record existed to indict. Nonetheless, investigators did discover that in August 1987, Robert had filed an assault report from a hospital in which he alleged a named Larry Pearson had deeply bitten his penis during oral sex, causing a laceration. An interview with Robert Sheldon's employers at Kansas City manufacturing plant had confirmed that the young man had been a reliable employee of theirs, but that he had suddenly ceased attending work in April 1985. Shortly after the search of 4315 Charlotte Street had concluded, Robert was informed of the discoveries in his properties. At this same afternoon, he was ordered to pose for the series of nude photographs for the comparison with the Polaroid images he had taken. Investigators attempted to conduct the first formal investigation with him, although Robert simply invoked his right to silence in the setting. Investigators later sought to obtain handwriting samples from Robert in an effort to prove he had written the notes found within the various stenographer pads discovered at his house. He refused to cooperate and was sentenced to 6 months in jail for contempt of court. Initially, Robert was formally charged with 1 count of felonious resistant, 1 count of assault, and 7 counts of forcible sodomy. As investigators continued their investigations into the discoveries at the property, he assigned a temporary public defender as his legal representative and held in protective custody in the Jackson County Jail in lieu of $500,000 bail. That is the equivalent of almost $1.1 million in today's world. In late April, the skull found inside Robert's closet was identified via dental x-rays obtained via a subpoena from the University of Kansas Medical Center as that of Robert Sheldon. The same day, a dental identification was made upon Sheldon's skull. 2 men separately phoned the Kansas City Police Department to state one of 7 unidentified young men depicted in a photographic array released to the media on April 27 was a former high school acquaintance of theirs named Mark Wallace. When detective contacted Wallace's sister, she stated her brother had been missing since mid of 1985. Shortly thereafter, investigators discovered that photograph D released to the media in the same array was one of Larry Wayne Pearson. As Pearson had once been a ward of the court in Wichita, his dental records were discovered and compared with the skull found in Robert's backyard. Robert would be formally charged with the murder by dismemberment of Larry Wayne Pearson in July after he heard the plea was entered following late morning recess. In the arraignment hearing into the particular murder, it came as a surprise to both the judge and the prosecuting attorneys. The plea was entered following the late morning recess. The prosecution team assigned to the case accepted the plea, with assistant prosecutors Pat Hall later explaining his decision as being in the best interest of our client and the people in the state of Missouri. Following the submission and acceptance of this plea, the judge insisted that Robert confess under the oath as to Pearson's death. In response to questioning by his attorneys, Robert stated that he put a plastic bag over his head and he tied it with a rope and allowed him to suffocate. When asked if he performed this act on purpose and with malice thought, Robert simply stated, yes. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Upon being sentenced, Robert was transferred to the Missouri State Penitentiary to commence his life sentence. He would later be temporarily placed in protective custody at the Potosi Correctional Center due to concerns of his safety. A second guilty plea was submitted before the Jackson County Court on August 24th, earned Robert an extra life sentence without the possibility of parole for the charge of forcible sodomy against Christopher Bryson. He would also receive a further term of 7 years pertaining to 1 count of felonious resistance against Bryson on this date. Despite initially pleading not guilty to the remaining 5 murders, on September 13, 1988, with the agreement of his 2 defense attorneys, Berdella ultimately conducted a plea bargain with the prosecutors to avoid the death penalty. In these remaining charges, in this plea bargain, Robert agreed to confess in graphic detail as to whom he had killed, what indignities he had subjected each victim, how he had killed each victim, and what he had done with their bodies. These confessions were given to prosecutors in the days between the month of December 13 and December 15 of 1988. In return for his cooperation, the prosecution agreed not to seek the death penalty at a formal hearing scheduled for 9 a.m. on December 9th. On December 19th, 1988, Robert formally waived his rights to be tried for any of the outstanding murder charges, upon the understanding that he was to be convicted of the further count of first-degree murder, that of Robert Sheldon, and 4 counts of second-degree murder. He formally pleaded guilty to each of these charges before Judge Robert Myers in the Jackson Court Circuit Court. Members of the public were prohibited from attending this hearing, with only family members of his victims and news reporters permitted access to the proceedings. Judge Myers imposed 5 further concurrent life sentences, with an additional condition barring any future prospect of parole. So he will never get parole in the first-degree murder which he pleaded guilty. Robert provided testimony to prosecutors between December 13 and December 15, after he changed his plea and sought approval of their agreement not to seek the death penalty against him if he fully confessed. And in this testimony, Robert claimed the movie he had first seen in 1965, The Collector, had left a major impression on him. Following the senses of shock and disgust he claimed to have initially experienced after killing his first victim, the movie had resurfaced in his memory and subsequently became a motivating psychological force in his actions he exhibited against his victims in his subsequent murders. His victims, he stated to investigators, had lost any degree of humanity in his eyes, the ones he had chosen to render them captive. Robert confessed to many of the abbreviated entries within his torture logs. Robert confessed to every murder in his entry of his diary, with the torture logs that showed and detailed every abuse method that he used against his victims, whereas others would describe either their reactions to these ongoing acts of abuse or torture, or his initial observations upon viewing them when he entered the room when he kept them restrained. He also explained various methods that he used to torture his victims: electric shocks that he used against James Ferris, the injections that he injected on their backs. Furthermore, Robert confessed to having alternately buried the 2 victims' heads in his backyard, adding that he retrieved and cleaned the first skull of that Robert Sheldon. At the time he buried victim Larry Pearson's head in the same hole Sheldon's skull was that which he placed inside a closet on the 2nd floor of his property. In an area of the household, Robert referred to it as my gallery area. Just shows how sick and twisted Robert was. Robert removed the teeth from the skull. In addition, he denied media rumors in an interview that he had been engaged in any Satanism, or that he had sold sections of his victims' bodies at a flea market booth.
Mr. Berdella, you're sitting here as a man who's going to spend the rest of his life in prison. You've confessed to murder of 6 young men in this city and crimes that horrified the city and much of the country. You've confessed to, in various degrees, felonious restraint, drugging people, sexually abusing them, torturing them, killing them, dismembering them. And until now, you've refused all interviews. So in light of all those facts, I have to ask you, why are you here? What is it you have to say to us? What is it you want to say about yourself in this case?
Well, I've had the media clamoring to get interviews with me. And after I made my last pleas, I wanted to get at least part of my side of it out. I've found it very hard to find any way to do that in Kansas City. The media has so biased my case, portraying me as being non-human is no separate from the way I treated my victims. I treated them as something less than human, nothing more than a play toy or not a play object. This is what the media has done to me. It's dehumanized me so that it can be, along with the public, that things like human sacrifice, Satanism, demonic practices are more believable than me being the neighbor next door who reached a point in his life where he could do monstrous acts. That's not the same thing as being a monster. I kept sheets of paper that I had made some notations on. This is between the mattress and springs on my bed. This is one of those packages containing numerous photographs and what became to be known as meticulous, methodical diaries. Those pieces of paper in there are these meticulous diaries.
These are the pictures of the more than 200 photographs, some of them of young men, sexual partners, and these are in some ways, and these that we see here are the sheets of paper upon which you made notes.
Right.
See. We recall we mentioned before that there were reports in the Westport flea market where you had your shop that people would say, oh yes, I do remember he had these strange smelling dishes of food, that he had bead bones. And later on there were speculations, at least in the community and in some aspects of the media, that the remains of your victim were somehow being transported and prepared as meals and prepared as jewelry.
Your shop.
I was quickly able to identify to the police the other dealers in that section of the market where we rotated potluck rather than eat the flea market food again. And that you could question any of these people, and they'd be able to tell you that the food was good. There was nothing suspect about the turkey or ham or beef that was in these dishes.
It seems to me that you're suggesting that had the police done their job, had they followed the leads, had they really been on your case prior to April 2nd, 1988, they would have caught you, and some of this suffering could have been prevented.
Maybe not caught me. Scared me off, maybe. Prevented things from happening after Hal? Definitely.
In a way, do you wish they had?
Yes.
Robert was able to name all of his victims to investigators, although one victim, Mark Wallace, had been seized by opportunity when he had discovered him seeking shelter from a severe thunderstorm in his tool shed. His other 5 victims had been captured after he had unsuccessfully tried to steer them away from their general lifestyles, and has thus simply become frustrated in his efforts of trying to change their lives. On each victim's capture, Robert described in graphic and sexual, physical, and emotional detail the abuse that he had subjected each victim and the torture logs that he recorded. He also told investigators on December 14th that he was capturing them first developed. Nonetheless, he did claim that he had tried to prevent any of his victims from developing any form of malnutrition or infection by occasionally administering antibiotics or nutrients intravenously as his abuse and torture escalated. The method of torture he exhibited against his victims had included an administration of high. Robert also confessed that the level of abuse he inflicted had increased with each successive victim, as he had viewed the Polaroid images he had taken of his victims as being a trophy or record of events. Although police extensively searched for the remains of Robert's victims throughout their initial investigations into his crimes, the confession Robert provided to investigators in the autumn of 1988 confirmed the dismemberment bodies of all 6 of his victims had been stewed in trash bags and subsequently taken to a landfill. Consequently, their bodies were never recovered. That is absolutely brutal. The fact that their skulls or just their parts have never been discovered or never been recovered, that is truly, truly sad. In the years following his 1988 convictions and incarcerations, Robert granted an interview to the Missouri-based television station KCPT and corresponded with numerous individuals to all concerned. While in prison, Robert Berdella also logged several complaints with prison officials regarding prison conditions. He also wrote several letters to local ministers claiming that prison officials knew of his high blood pressure, yet were not providing him with his prescribed heart medication. Years after his conviction, in 1992, Robert Berdella contacted the counselor whom he had met when he was first incarcerated, Roger Coleman. He informed Coleman of his distress due to staff at Missouri State Penitentiary withholding his heart medication. At 2 p.m. on October 8, 1992, Robert Berdella complained to prison staff of severe heart pains and was taken from his cell to the prison infirmary. Medical staff determined his heart was unstable and called an ambulance. Robert was taken to a hospital in Columbia, Missouri, where he was pronounced dead from a heart attack at 3:55 p.m. He was 43 years old. Shortly after the judge at his trial, Alvin Randall, was informed of Robert's death. In response, Randall sarcastically remarked, "Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy." Moreover, despite his claims to media, individuals who he had contacted in the years of his incarceration, he never expressed any degree of remorse for his actions and tersely and occasionally referred to his victims as play toys in an interview he granted shortly before his death. In November 1988, auctions of Robert's collection of artifacts were confiscated from his home, and business were held on 4 separate dates, with the intention that all proceeds raised in the auctions to be used to pay legal fees within ongoing legal proceedings. The auction attracted considerable nation interest, attracting telephone bids from across the United States. Although many items sold for less than expected price, by the end of the first day auctioning alone, more than $60,000 had been raised for this purpose. That is the equivalent of $137,000 in today's stock market. Robert's house was purchased by a local businessman for an undisclosed sum in December 88. The property was demolished. Robert Berdella abducted, tortured, and murdered at least 6 young men. We gotta remember these 6 young men who their lives were taken pretty fast by this monster. Jerry Howell was just 19. Robert Sheldon, 20 years of age. Mark Wallace, 27. James Ferris, 25. Todd Stoops, 23. And Larry Wayne Pearson, who was 20 years old. Anyways, thank you guys for watching this video. A little different, just we had to talk about this man and this crazy shit that he did, and the maniac that he was, and the terror that he caused in Kansas City in the mid to late 80s. He caused havoc. He took the lives of 6 men who were just trying to make it in life, who were just trying to find a way to enjoy life, and they were taken savagely by a demented, crazy maniac by the name
of Robert Berdella Jr., the Kansas City Butcher.
Of the 1980s,